Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marco Lavecchia, Vice President of Sales with CareWorks. I just want to thank you very much for joining us on this afternoon's webinar if you're on the East Coast, and early morning if you're on the West Coast. In conjunction with Pink Elephant and Troy DuMoulin, we're very pleased to have Troy with us today. Troy is the VP of Research and Development with Pink Elephant, leader in global education, training, and consulting on ITIL and IT service management. And Troy, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great, Mark. Thank you.
Pleased to have you, and I know that we have a lot of people that are signing up. So hopefully everybody can get on board. We have a good attendee list this afternoon, and I just want to thank everybody for taking time out of your day to learning a little bit more about IT service management. And Troy was a great topic this afternoon in terms of helping organizations and companies and giving them some great ideas in terms of how they can become a little bit more efficient in terms of how they deliver services. We also have Sean Bosnell, who's VP of Technology here at CareWorks, in charge of all technology needs based on a number of different sides of our business. For those of you who are not aware of who CareWorks is, we're one of the largest IT service management and MSPs around the world. We consistently rank on the top 100 global managed IT lists that are basically pushed out in the marketplace. And what's really kind of interesting about our business model in terms of what we do, we really kind of view ourselves as a one-stop shop for everything IT. We have a lot of customers that are in the SMB market space, but we also focus a major part of our business both into the mid-market and enterprise space as well, with basically pretty much our service desk, managed IT, and then along with another component of our business, which is basically in the senior care market space, where we support thousands and thousands of businesses across the whole entire market space in terms of how we support them. When you take a look at CareWorks, one of the value propositions that we bring to the table is basically we take a look at a different component that clients engage with us both on service desk, where organizations will come to CareWorks and say, hey, listen, you know what, we'd like to augment and provide more support to our level 1 or level 2 service desk team, or we can also do some outsourcing either completely after hours or 24/7. IT automation, where we use remote monitoring and management applications to do proactive monitoring management that Troy will talk a little bit about today in terms of leveraging the right tools and technologies in terms of how to support your customers or your employees. We also leverage self-service portals as well through ServiceNow and IT service management. So we're a ServiceNow partner that we actually sell ServiceNow in a SaaS-based offering, basically the enterprise application for rapid deployment and pre-configured arrangements within ServiceNow. It's a new way in terms of how we're taking ServiceNow to the marketplace to basically bring the best ITSM application down into the mid-market to organizations that typically either can't afford it or can't justify, for instance, how the ROI looks like. So when we take a look at everything that we bring to the table, our conversations, they really apply to how we support our customers here at CareWorks. Not only can we be the complete outsourced IT department for organizations, but we work in conjunction with, for instance, large IT departments as well, from organizations that have 15,000 employees across the organizations that have 100,000 employees, with some of our largest customers that we have in the marketplace. And so we thought it was really worthwhile to bring somebody that has the experience that Troy has in the marketplace in terms of really kind of helping people understand in terms of what are the things in terms of affecting unplanned work and increasing customer value. And Troy, I think this is something that's really important for a lot of businesses today, big or small, in terms of if we can increase efficiencies within the businesses today, really what does that mean? How does it impact organizations? And I see your first slide here, you talk about benefit, cost, and value. And I'd just love to hear more in terms of how you feel this all ties into businesses that are listening to us this afternoon.
Absolutely, Mark. So it's definitely my focus today to tell a story about business value. So we're going to be focusing on some core processes of service operation, and most of the time we focus on those relative to what does a good support process look like. I want to put a different angle, a different twist on it today, and I want to express and describe these processes and when they're working well and when they're not working well in the context of value. So let's get down to brass tacks with that word value, because that could mean many different things. But let's put it this way. Time, as a professional services organization, as a business which is trying to produce value-oriented results, time is our most precious commodity. And we spend time in various pursuits, and those pursuits are either going to be directly contributing value or they're not going to be contributing value. One of the things that I like to talk about when I'm not talking about service management is lean. And lean really has some simplistic way of looking at life, but it's very practical. In essence, all the time you have can be broken down into either value-added, necessary, administrative type work, second, and the third element being non-value. And we have to look very carefully about what percentage of our time is directly producing value-added activities and which percent is doing, we'll call it break-fix for a lack of a better word for the moment, because if I'm doing support, unless your job is to be an IT professional sitting beside the proverbial and metaphorical fire pole, and that's your job is to wait for calls to come in, then the majority of your time, in principle, should be spent on value-added planned work versus unplanned work. And that's what we're going to be talking about. I'll describe and show some examples about what the typical person looks like in a given week relative to these two terms. So this benefit, optimization is about taking more of your time, right, towards value added and reducing the cost, so we're just doing just enough administrative, thereby increasing value. So to give you an example and a couple of different stories here, I'm just going to move my mouse down, move the slide ahead. One more time. There we go. We're going to start with, why should we care? I'm going to talk about the business drivers for even having this conversation. Of course, there's the whole, if we have a great support process, that means the business we serve is going to be in themselves producing more value when they're up and productive. But I'm going to put this in the context of just your time and show you what that means relative to unplanned versus planned. Then I'm going to describe how these processes, which are well known, incident management, problem, and even change, work together in a virtuous cycle to reduce unplanned time. And that is a question, because we're going to find that incident, problem, and change working collectively actually have to all be working collectively to do that goal. One of them, incident, will not necessarily get you where you want to go. And we'll look at how do we do value-based prioritization. With Lean and with Agile, there's a whole discussion now about working on the most important things, product backlog prioritization. But how do we apply the same principles of value-based prioritization to our support processes? We're going to dig a little bit into that question as well. So let's go on a bit of a journey here. So here's the situation. It's a simple picture, but it kind of describes life for the majority of us probably on the phone today. So we've got the now, and our day-to-day activities look something like this for most of us. We get caught up in unplanned work, caught up in this break-fix activity, caught up with firefighting mode. And so this is that black you see here on the current situation. And then there's another aspect of our lives, which is simply the meetings we attend in the normal cadence of life. And of course, some of you have heavier meeting schedules than others. In fact, some of you have meetings to go plan meetings. And this is an interesting dilemma, because if you think about the total percentage of capacity we spend on unplanned work and the meetings, which you have to argue are not actually getting work done, they're meeting about getting work done unless you're in a work group, accomplishing something in a meeting. That leaves very little at the end of the day for value added or even improvement, if you want to go that far, innovation and continual improvement. So what we're trying to do with this conversation today is, identify that there's always going to be the surprise of unplanned work. And by the way, we'll talk about types of unplanned work and give you some examples. But for the most part, unplanned surprise doesn't mean positive. It's typically a negative. Yes, there's a certain percentage of what might happen that might be, getting surprised by joy. But the reality is the majority of it you wish didn't, pop up that day. So how do we claw back this capacity situation and give a higher percentage of our total value to value-added work? So let's walk through a bit of a scenario just to give you a sense of how bad it actually is. So I'd like to talk about 3 core value streams, and that value stream is in the life cycle concept. So we are in the business in IT of a supply chain. We receive demand on one end. This could be strategic demand, that could be requests for enhancement, that could be operational demand coming in through an incident type of process. But all of this demand, in essence, has to be responded to. And that is, in essence, how we plan, build, and of course run. And if you're an ITIL person, you'll know that the words we use are service strategy, service design, service transition, service operation, but the same thing applies. We have this, this value chain where we take a request in one side and we get something out the other side. Now let me describe all of the processes in that context in 3 primary bars that you see here. I'll call them value streams for now. Initially, what happens in an organization, actually I'll go back one before I move that forward, is we focus on the middle one. This is the value-added area of net new value creation. This is projects, this is application enhancements. In essence, these are the planned activities. And you can argue that there's roughly 4 types of planned activities which would be positive. There is the customer net new initiatives. We have foundational IT projects, infrastructure-wide that we need to put in place to do the customer initiatives. We have changes, because by nature changes are positive. They're typically trying to remove error or enhance. And we have operate. Some people are simply paid to watch screens and make sure that things are working the way they are. Operate is planned work. Now, what we typically do in an organization, if we're going to invest in improvement of any of our processes, is we invest in our SDLC, our project management capability, and so we focus on that value area first. Makes sense. That's where net new value is created. So imagine, if you will, you have these series of initiatives kicking off. Each project sets up and they second and pull to themselves the right resource and skills they need. Now each of these projects are, using a metaphor, like a train on its own track. And now I set them up and I get them going, and they're off going towards production. Now I set up another 5 or 6 of these self-contained entities called projects or initiatives. Now the interesting thing is the project itself is coordinated, but there is no real orchestration or coordination amongst the projects. They're almost self-managed entities, if you will. Now, what happens is that they're all moving towards the same production environment called, live, called production. And, if we're having a back and forth conversation, I'd ask you, what is the worst day to be on the service desk? And most people will say, of course, it's Monday. And you say, why? Because Monday, you're dealing with all the changes that came in on the weekend. Now, the question you have to think about in your head is, did those changes land hard or did they land soft? Meaning, were you surprised by unplanned work on Monday? And if you're like most, you'll know that the phone goes off the hook on Monday. Now you had, unless you're one of these support people, planned to do planned work, one of those 4 things we talked about earlier. That was what you came in on Monday to do. But you get pulled into this firefighting mode now. Monday, goes by, and you're lucky if you actually clear the initiative or the errors by Monday, but typically often what happens is Tuesday, you're still dealing with issues that arose from the weekend, and now finally Wednesday, you come to work on Wednesday morning, and now you face your inbox, which you haven't dealt with for 2 days. So Wednesday, you pretty much, you're catching up. Now I haven't even mentioned, of course, the meetings, so I'd like you to consider this. Most people, if you had to think about this logically, really get started on what they plan to do Monday on Thursday. So this is where we start to ask ourselves, what percentage of my total week capacity am I actually working on planned, aka value-added work? Because what's happening for most organizations is this. We're missing this orchestration component. So on the top layer, we have these processes which help us to do portfolio management, understand both non-functional as well as functional requirements from availability, capacity, supplier management, security, disaster recovery. And then we have these processes which help to orchestrate the integration of all of these planes, trains, and automobiles all landing at the same weekend on a common runway. That would be ideal, unless they're not being orchestrated and they're all coming in under their own power of communication. And the reality is we don't see this orchestration in place. So that's one of the reasons why we have such issues with unplanned work. But we are also spending an inordinate amount of time in this third value stream at the bottom that you see, which is support. Now the problem with that is you have a professional, could be yourself, who has a role to play in all three of these value streams. But if you think about it, we're spending, let's say, on average, 80% when you consider unplanned plus meetings in unplanned work. What percentage do I have left to give back to this value-added activity? Again, it's all about time and capacity. Now, ideally, what we'd have is a feedback loop. We'd say, hey, this isn't a cool thing. I've got all this time that I'm spending on non-value added work. What do I do to start removing this, removing the sources of the errors, the sources of the rework, the sources of the unplanned work over time from my environment? So that feedback loop, in principle, if it existed, would begin to reduce the percentage of unplanned work, allowing you to add more of your time to value add. Again, if it actually existed. Now, let's talk about how that actually comes to bear. So what I just described to you, unfortunately, is probably much too much something that you're familiar with, right? But what I've described to you is a series of unfortunate events that collectively, collaborate together to eat your lunch from a point of view of the available capacity that you have. So how do we get off this, what I call squeaky hamster wheel of death? Because over time, your new initiatives, your new requirements, your requests, they don't stop coming in. But over time, if we're not dealing with the technical debt that's been building up and not removing these sources of unplanned work, there's at some point in your future, hopefully not near, that hamster wheel gets faster than you can run. And then, of course, the results are not pleasant. So if I've painted a picture to get your attention, I hope I have, because I'm going to introduce to you how specific processes get you off this hamster wheel. And to quote, our friend Albert Einstein's here, the definition of insanity would be, to expect that you would do the same thing over and over again and get different results. So let's figure out what we can do to actually change this story. So the story begins with the fact that every day we have events. These events are both virtuous, some things we want to track because we want to track their completion, like a backup being completed or a batch job being finalized. But there are many things in our environment we need to track from the point of view of this is not expected, it's a surprise, not a positive one, and so how do I deal with it? I can put, triggers in place, put percentage of capacity utilized on a server, for example, or my CPU, in which trigger a process. I can put automation in place to detect an out-of-control situation before my customer calls me and says, hey, something's not working. So the key thing about understanding events is that some events have to simply be triggered and tracked, or tracked, I should say. Other events need predefined processes behind them so that when we see this red, yellow, or green light, it's not simply, oh, we have a red light, what do? We have a trigger set of responses which ideally can be automated to, again, shorten the mean time to repair. So first of all, we understand that there are some events that give us a great deal of anxiety. So if we're going to have anxious people, we have to have processes to deal with anxiety. So that brings us to the incident management world. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about this because most of you will have a process out there to deal with unexpected and not positive surprise. Because the reality is we know that incidents will occur. We can do something about reducing their total volume if we're actually trying to do that. But the reality is we have to be able to respond quickly to restore service. Now, where I'm going with this is from an unplanned perspective, it's not enough just to have a process that says, it's broken, let's put a response in place, let's repair it. Because I could do that thousands of times a year, tens of thousands of times a year, but if I've never got that feedback loop in place, if I haven't said, hey, listen, I've got a pattern that I'm seeing, I have to understand that just by resolving incidents faster, I'm never doing anything about removing unplanned work. What you are doing is being able to get out of the way faster. Well, that's wonderful. But now, you're just making room for more incidents and you're still on this hamster wheel. So just because you're getting a process in place to respond quickly and to restore service quickly doesn't mean that you have identified that you've, repeatedly, thousands of times apparently, restored the same service without ever asking the question why. An interesting perspective is that the why question comes from a process called problem management, which of course is different, as we're going to discuss in a few minutes, from incident management. But again, even asking why is not quite enough. We'll have to close the loop with doing something about it. So yes, there's a process for identifying and restoring. Now, time. Really, there's actually 3 break-fix support processes which actually come to bear at different levels of crisis. Now, people don't often think about it this way, but I want you to think about that there are actually 3 service restoration processes. There is normal incident management, meaning I have a process which takes care of the day-to-day expected or unexpected incidents. But then there's a process called major incident management. And so this is a process which takes care of something that's massively impactful to your organization, that requires an all-hands-on-deck approach, and makes sure that based on the fact that we've defined this now as a major incident, not just a normal incident, everyone agrees, they put down whatever they're working on, and they move rapidly to some kind of war room or telecom bridge. Now, interesting piece of data. Over 40% of the organizations that I saw in a recent research article have no defined process for how do you trigger a major incident, and who triggers that major incident, and how is it assembled. Now, again, if it happens, and it's going to happen, not having a plan, well, that's going to mean time delay. In fact, the same research that I was looking at demonstrated that the average organization spends 27 minutes on average just assembling once someone has decided something is a major incident. So there's this major incident response process. But even that has a process above that, which is at what point can you, delay no longer. You have attempted to do through experimentation a recovery using your major incident approach, but now you have to fail over to a disaster recovery or crisis management process. So these 3 processes are layered in essence relative to the impact that's being experienced. They're triggering each other, or at least they should, and there's someone who has the responsibility and accountability to know when one becomes another, and so on. Again, what is not defined ahead of time, you're going to spend all this time wasting, relative to understanding how do you move and respond quickly. But again, we're still talking a response at this point. So if we're going to respond, before we move on to problem management, let's talk about value-based prioritization, because in essence, one of the core policies that we want to put in place with any organization is that we could have, half a dozen things which have, currently gone wrong, but that we're working on. Which one of them should get the highest value-added attention? So just like in Agile, we think about working on the features which have the highest business value. By principle, we have a process and a policy within that process that says we all agree that this is the priority relative to another incident, and we all agree as a group that big equals big and small equals small. Now, the reality is, in my experience, this is a very, very rare occurrence. Well, you have a severity or priority thing in your tool, but you have to ask yourself, is it reality for you that you have agreement across the organization and the various support bodies that are part of that, that you all agree how fast and how priority-wise you will put things into context? You all agree how big is big and how small is small. And it's not just one dimension. There, as you can see, there's many different perspectives here that I have to think about. Financial risk, business risk, customer satisfaction, legal requirements. And so one of the things that we need to do is create a priority model that triggers a shared response across the agency that is supporting this process. Now, going back to that question about the major incident versus the normal incident, is a major incident always what you would call a priority one? Well, it depends. So let me share with you an example. So again, it's interesting to point out that this policy that we're talking about right now, this value-based prioritization of what work we do, supposedly is something that every organization would have as the basic, most simple policy they have. Maybe simple is not the word, but the core policy they have to build a shared support mindset. I can also share with you that the reality is that's almost non-existent. The policy might exist, but its shared belief does not. And so what happens is you have all kinds of subjective debate and relativity around what a major incident is versus a high severity versus a medium, because you think it's a severity of priority 1, I think it's a severity priority 2, and we all agree to disagree, and meanwhile, the meantime, the repair is going through the roof, and time is elapsing, and again, time is wasted. So we're not clawing back any of this time to use for more value-added things because we couldn't even get this basic policy agreed. And what happens here, just consider this, when you have no shared agreement across the organization about how big is big and how small is small, how much time do you waste in debate? All right? How could you even hope to stand up behind a service level agreement when you collectively don't have agreement around just this basic concept? But again, if this is any misery loves company, this is my experience. 8 out of 10 organizations struggle with this basic thing. So one way to do this, just to give you an example using this model, is to make it focus on business value. How do you do that? Well, we have to first go back to the model of the organization's mission. Okay, so if you're a revenue-based organization, well, obviously, services which generate revenue directly would have priority, if they were broken, over services which are indirect or remotely directed to revenue. So when it comes to the urgency concept, which is how fast do we move, we have to then classify ahead of time using classification structures. When this is broken, is it a business critical? Is it support to business critical, or is it non-urgent? Right? The online trading or application, investment application has to have a different level of mission criticality than your internal company intranet portal. Now, so degrees of urgency are about degrees of business risk. On the left, we have to understand also that an individual who's hard down or not able to work cannot logically be equal to an entire organizational wide failure. So we have this degree of failure conversation. Now, you might be thinking, what about VIPs and what about certain people on the payroll? Well, there's actually something to that. Because if you have an individual who's mission critical to revenue, well then obviously that person is going to have a role responsible for revenue that has to be considered more urgent or higher degree of impact than perhaps someone who's less so. So even the role relative to are they in a VIP classification can be brought into this model. So what we're talking about here is value-based prioritization for support to make sure that we're always focusing on the highest value activities. Now, I'm using this in the incident concept, but this priority model for value-based work is equally applied to problem management because a priority 1 problem would take preference and precedent over a priority 3 problem for root cause. A priority 1 change, a priority 1 release would have to jump the queue, right, in relative to your release scheduling. So this value-based prioritization is not just for break fix, but it's a model and core policy to basically make sure that we're always doing the higher value-added work first. But again, sadly, in my experience, often is in complete disarray. Now, we have to do something about getting off this hamster wheel of death. Okay, so we've got all of this incident data. Now, first I'll make an assumption that we're properly classifying and using classification structures, that we can actually use that classification to say we've got trends. This is the world of pattern matching. And by the way, it's the first step into problem management. We have to be able to identify patterns, and if those patterns represent that we've got a trend happening, this has to be the input to problem management. Now, an interesting point of reference, we have been working with organizations for 20+ years. Of all of the operation type processes, it's interesting to note problem management has the lowest level of maturity. It's almost like we like the hamster wheel of death. We resolve it very fast, but we never do anything about getting off of it. Now, sure, you might, do major incident reviews and you do root cause analysis for the stuff that, the big stuff you are so embarrassed about you never want to repeat again, and we do proper analysis at that point. But when it comes to non-major incidents, the thousands of things you resolve monthly, annually, what are you doing about that? Because that's where these incidents are truly eating your lunch when it comes to the time available for value-based work. So if you're not doing this pattern recognition for identifying trends, you're not doing anything really about getting off the hamster wheel and removing the sources of unplanned work. So this means it's a different process, right? This is investigation. This is not the moment of time I have to respond and quickly resolve. This is saying, Houston, we've got a problem. What's the root cause behind this? And how do I correlate all this data that I'm looking at now to say, these are the patterns, these are the trends that I've actually observed, and if I go after the higher value items first, I can begin to claw back sanity both for myself but also for the business I serve. Again, the sad point is that this problem management process is, in essence, the missing link. A lot of organizations, they'll try to do things, out of good intent, and I have, lived this experience myself, where they'll say, okay, you're the incident management person, right? You're the service desk manager. We want you to be involved with problem management as well as incident management. Okay, now think about that. You spend all this time resolving incidents. Most of your week is spent doing this. You can barely keep up to unplanned work, right? You only have like 10%, 20% of your time left for planned work. At what point did you think you were actually going to start, carving out time to do some deep navel gazing here for root cause analysis? The tyranny of the urgent always takes over the good and the necessary. So in my personal experience and recommendation, it's probably never really a good idea to give the problem process activities to the same people you have doing your break fix. Or if they're on the same team, they need to be split in their responsibilities so that there are people who can say, I see a pattern, and they can start to investigate the root cause. And even while they're working on the root cause, they might come up with a workaround, because A, the solution might be outside of your control to actually do anything about, or B, it might take some time. So even while we're waiting in this pending state, I'm getting faster workaround information back to the response cycle, right? So this conversation of root cause and workaround gives me this principle. Now I know it's an error, and I can do something about it. So we're starting to come around this virtuous feedback loop now. But the key thing, going back to our friend Mr. Einstein here, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we have used when we created them. So we have to begin to say, what are the sources of this unplanned work? How do we get off this hamster wheel, And we get to do and spend time and invest time in deep investigation and diagnosis, because otherwise we never seem to get ahead. Now, one point of reference for you, just as a tip, this is an experiential scenario. I've worked with many organizations which have attempted to, do something about this problem identification, pattern identification, correlation, and they set up a problem team. And they set up 2 or 3, 4 people whose job it is to go data mining to look for the patterns, and so they begin to identify the list, right? And they start to prioritize the list, and they start to coordinate meetings, and they do reporting around this problem. But here's my observation. If the roles and responsibilities for problem management are simply centralized in this so-called problem group, nothing really ever gets done. Because the people who are going to do the root cause to the point of known error, and then after known error, figure out the solution they're going to use, they're not that team. Those aren't the technical specialists which do the work or assign people to the work. So what happens when you have a central team without a distributed set of roles existing in the function is you basically build an inventory of problems that you would never really do anything about. So what have you gained? Well, at least you know what your problems are, but you're still not gaining back that precious time to use for more value-added work. So key and critical in my experience is that not only do you have the central problem team identifying and helping to kind of give a global perspective of the problems in your organization, but now I need an individual in each of the functional areas which is going to have a problem coordinator hat. For that team, they represent the resource or the coordination of the resources to assist to actually do the work of the process, the root cause, the coordination of solutioning, etc. And it's when you have this distributed model, you begin to actually see, the ability to start cutting down and to start whittling away at the repetitive things that are causing your unplanned work. So again, it's not enough just to have people who look at it, but you have to have resources, ideally in the distributed environment, who actually do the work. Now, kind of to end off here, and I'll be kicking it back over to my friends at CareWorks, I want to share with you a story. I'll just take a quick sip. So here's my story. This is an actual story from a client that I worked with a few years ago, and it's going to demonstrate the entire closed loop, the virtuous feedback loop that I represented on that earlier slide. So this was a financial institution, and they had a repeat type of incident. It didn't occur to them that they had a repeat type of incident, but at least until several months. But it became self-evident. And what was happening was that almost on a monthly basis, roughly around the end of the month, they would have a complete email meltdown failure. And this was a wide outage across, almost the entire organization. And of course, everyone scrambles, and everyone is basically, on deck to get this resolved because email is a mission-critical service. And so they did this month over month over month, and all these incident tickets would come in, and they would say, yeah, we got all this stuff. It's a major incident. They'd call the crisis team, and they would do the war room and the telco region, but they would do this month after month until at one point the executive says, what are we doing, and why is this happening? That actually only happened about 4 to 5 months into this cycle, by the way. And so they began to say, well, let's call a problem and let's put a problem team together to investigate why we see this happening. At first, they really couldn't figure it out. They thought it was memory leaks, so they changed the memory, thought it might be capacity, they changed the box it was sitting in, but the reality is none of these scenarios actually worked until they began to watch the pattern. And the pattern, as I mentioned, was kind of monthly. And they realized that it was at the month-end close, and again, it's the financial institutions, a lot of activities happening on the month end, that it seemed to trigger. And so they began to investigate, and the known error became this. 6 months earlier, a security policy had been put in place that said we needed to lock down all of the cabinets. And so they, in essence, put locked glass doors on front of all of the cabinets to restrict access to specific servers. Now, they didn't understand that in one of the cabinets, at least where the email was, email servers, the cooling and the climate control was not adequate. So at the end of the month, under high load, what would happen is that we would have a server meltdown practically. It would overheat, and they would have to shut the thing off, cool it down, reboot it, and it would actually come back up again. So now, interesting, it's not even a technical failure, it's actually environmental. The solutions are put forward, and there are a couple. We could remove the door. Of course, that would violate the previous security identified need. We could upgrade the cabinet, and we could change the environmental for the entire data center. Different options were put forward, and in this specific scenario, by the way, it was chosen to take the door off that specific server, much to the chagrin of the security folks, but that was the route they went. And so what happened here was a request for change was put through, removing the source of this error, so it didn't reoccur the next month, and we began to claw back on the surprise of unplanned work. Now, as I mentioned, it was 4 months before that pattern actually was identified, and they did something about it. That was 4 months of wasted time pulling together almost an IT-wide crisis team approach to resolve this. You cannot get off this hamster wheel of death until you put the whole cycle of these processes together. And that means they have to work collectively, share classification, and share this sense of value-based prioritization. I would like to say that that's my experience in most organizations, but that is not the case. They might have a good incident process, they might even have change, but they're missing the central link of problem. Because, again, what got you this far won't get you out of the situation unless you put the full loop into place. So these processes might look basic, but the reality is they have a much deeper implication to value-based generation than you might have thought before, especially when they work collectively. So Mark, I'm going to ask you, have you seen this in your client space?
Thanks, Troy. And I appreciate the information. Just an absolute ton of information there in terms of how we operate and obviously some great insight in terms of what different organizations can do. Actually, I'm going to throw that question over to Sean, because Sean comes to us with a ton of experience. Not only today is he and his team looking after, I would say probably close to about 100,000 devices from a management standpoint, but Sean has a lot of experience as well in terms of working in the telco space and running some big, large help desk environments. So Sean, what do you think in respect to what Troy talked today? When we take a look at incident, problem, and change management, what are you guys doing, and what are some of maybe the best practices that you guys have kind of incorporated into your business to make sure that this is something, one, that we're working on, but also something that's being tracked?
Yeah, thanks, Marco. I don't know if I could say it any better than Troy. A tool, any tool really, is only as good as the what you put into it, and at the end of the day, what you need to be able to put into these things is a lot of process and procedure. And one of the things that we're fortunate in being able to do is because we work with so many different organizations, we're able to take best practices from what we're learning from everybody's individual businesses and being able to apply that holistically across the ITSM tools and stuff that we work with, the tool bases, so that the team continues to get better and better and better. So that's definitely a huge advantage that we have. And
when you take a look at it, what are some of the and I don't think we need to go into specifics in terms of the names of the solutions and technologies, but what are some of the things that you've brought into the mix to make sure that we're dealing with this properly?
I mean, one of the more critical things that we see often is, and Troy talked about that, is kind of when an incident comes in, is sort of the chain of command, or the people that are involved in it or have a requirement to it. And I think that kind of falls into sort of the broad base wording of change management. So really the capability of taking that information, being able to apply and utilize the tool of choice to allow it to be able to direct that information to the proper people, and not have a ticket that would go to an L1 person, may sit there, or they may have to look at somebody else. If it's very clearly based on the type of incident, should go to a certain department or group of people. That change management stuff is really critically important to make sure that you have set up, or the workflows, and then ultimately having the process around those. And the other thing that I think gets missed a lot is continually reevaluating this. And I think Troy had mentioned that earlier, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Just because it's working really well today, I think it's one of these processes that needs to be continuously looked at. And that definitely ends up coming not necessarily from the services teams, but it actually comes from the rest of the people within the organization to take a look at and say, look, this is the way that we handle things. How did the tickets go with you? What was the outcome of it? Is it meeting your needs? Is there anything that we can improve upon? And then taking that feedback and applying it back against your processes and procedures.
That's great. And just for everybody that's on the line, if you do have a question for us, your phones are muted. If you'd like to ask a question, there's a chat section in the GoToMeeting that you could pose those questions, and we can ask some of our panelists. Troy, just going back to you, Sean kind of raises a good point, right? Like this goes beyond sometimes just the team that's receiving all of these tickets and having to deal with it. How does corporate culture and information and feedback kind of play into all of this?
Yeah, so it's really more about corporate culture and agreement on policy that is more important than just having people with roles and tools that supposedly support these processes. Because if you don't have a willingness to respond in an agreed time frame from your second and third level, though you've got this published policy around prioritization, then the tool itself, the process itself is at the whim of this shared belief in prioritization. Or if you have a culture that thinks, well, my job is I'm too highly paid to get into support. When something breaks, that's the help desk job. Then they don't realize that incident management is not equal to the help desk. That incident management is a process that the entire organization might be involved in, right? So this segmentation, that's below my pay grade, or I don't update the ticket or put anything there that is necessary because that's a service desk responsibility. These are already non-starters, and they start with this cultural belief system, which is faulty, right? Or this, disagreement that they want to help capture knowledge or do root cause because they don't realize the impact of the incidents on their day-to-day planned work. I'm a great believer in making the invisible visible. Until they see the impact, and like I shared with you at the beginning, that the average professional might spend 80% of their week in unplanned work, they don't even know they are on the hamster wheel, let alone get off of it. So this is a cultural belief that begins this process of change.
Absolutely, and I try and tie that back into driving efficiencies from your employees, right? Like businesses sometimes get into the habit of thinking that there's value in being in a reactive model and fighting fires all the time, but it's quite the opposite, right? Like Sean, when you take a look at your team and you're taking a look at utilization rates, is it not critical to you to really kind of see that if we can get somebody out of a reactive model and get them working on new types of projects that are maybe driving more value into the business or can even be tied to a revenue generator, is much better than being in that reactive hamster wheel type model?
Yeah, I think that's all. I think it's very critical, Marco. I think when we take a look at the tickets overall, and this is, you got to go back and you got to understand what's going on within an organization. But anytime you can take a look at the tickets and try to understand, where they're coming from and maybe what that root cause is, and then being able to apply, hopefully, a long-term solution to it, that's definitely critical because you don't want your team fixing the same issue over and over and over again. So that is something that happens nonstop.
Actually, let me give you a practical example of this whole belief system, how it impacts it, and your ability to actually do what I described today. So a lot of organizations struggle with getting people to spend the time or to take the time to capture knowledge, but also just capture information on an incident ticket. they resist going in there and updating with what they've done, or updating the classification structure to reflect more accurately the issue that's occurred, versus the first attempt at guesstimation that was done at the service desk. And so there's this belief that I've got no time, I don't really value that, so I'm not going to open a ticket, I'm just going to get her done and fix it. But that means that there's no data, or no accurate data, to do any pattern recognition, meaning they don't understand that the impact of their choice of not capturing some of this critical information is having a direct impact on their lives, because we haven't helped them make this correlation.
That's a good point.
And Troy, is it technology that's helping you doing this, to try and do all of this correlation? Like, how does a business really kind of get good at it?
I'd like to say that the tool is the key, but it's not really. You can do what we're describing with Excel spreadsheets as long as you use them the same way. The reality is, yes, a tool does support and help to speed up, but it only helps you speed up what you've already previously defined, right? So I'll give you another example. This is a bit of a case study. A few years back, I was doing an assessment with an organization, and they were in the middle of a tool acquisition project, and we were doing this assessment, and this was back a few years, and one of the gentlemen who we're interviewing, he has a couple of pagers on his belt plus his cell phone, and interesting, comes in with this kind of tool belt like Batman. And one of the things we asked is, can you please, out of courtesy, put your pagers and stuff on, stun, and turn them into mute for the period of our interview. Well, what happened in this scenario, he begins to take off these devices. There's 3 of them and 2 pagers, and the pager number 1 is starting to vibrate almost the moment he puts it down. He completely ignores it. All right, so I play the game. I'll ignore it too. About 5 minutes in, that thing has not ceased buzzing, and it's actually like 3 inches down the table. And I said, okay, sir, obviously someone's desperate to get a hold of you. Would you like to answer that? He said, oh, what? He looks surprised. Oh, no, don't worry about that. That's the pager connected to my IT service management tool. It buzzes every time, we have an incident that goes into SLA breach. And I said, oh, my gosh, that must be terrible. What's going on? Oh, don't worry about that. He says, reality is most of the time I have it on silent, but I flicked it to vibrate by accident. Now, we have like 10,000 incidents currently in SLA breach, so I have to wear it because it's a management policy. Can't be paid, $500,000 for this tool. We don't like the tool. In fact, we're in the middle of buying another one. And the reality is, this other pager and my cell phone is how people actually get a hold of me. And that struck me. This is so bizarre, but it's not that uncommon, because what happens is, this happens all the time. We buy this $500,000 tool with all the bells and whistles to support escalations and notifications, and then we take our best guess at creating these policies, or the service desk might do it on proxy because no one else gives them the time to do it, so they just turn it on. The world gets paged, and then we turn it all off. But because no one uses the same classification structure, no one cares about the same concept of value-based prioritization, I can't do any knowledge, trending out of this. Barely can use it for queue management, obviously not for escalation and notification automation. So I've got a $500,000 tool here with the basic functionality of Microsoft Notepad. Open and close, open and close. Now the question, Sean, is that the tool's fault? Or is there something much deeper here?
Yeah, ultimately it's much deeper, right? And I think that's the key right there. You could throw as much money at a tool as you want, and I think, and I don't know what the statistic is, Troy, you probably know it better than I do, but I think most CRM or ITSM tools that people purchase, they use 15% of its actual capability, something crazy like that. But
it's about 15. You're right.
And that's what it ends up coming down to is these organizations pay so much money on on being sold that this tool is going to solve all their problems and it's going to be nirvana. And in a lot of cases, it often brings additional issues to the forefront, and it really comes down to that organization, lack of process, and lack of ultimately buy-in from the organization itself. So
that last statement you made is critical. Having process is not even the issue, because I can sell you a process. In fact, I have one for sale if you want one. But the reality is, it's belief and shared belief in that process, which is even more important. Having a piece of paper that says something is useless unless we all agree to what it says, and we all act accordingly. So it's more about constancy of purpose and agreement. This is how we, the people, operate, than it is around anything else. Of course, we write it down so we have great clarification. We automate it to speed it up. But if we can't gain agreement out of the box that we all have this shared belief system in prioritization, then everything else is for naught. I'm going to have this, $500,000 tool that I don't think is working for me. In fact, I'm in the middle of buying another one because the last one is crap.
Great, some great back and forth and some information. Hey, listen, we're getting to the top of the hour. I just wanted to see if you guys had some last couple of minutes comments. I just want to respect everybody's time that's with us today. Troy, anything from your end?
Yeah, so if you really want to do yourselves a favor, folks, you have to start looking at problem management and truly begin to get off this hamster wheel of death. Incident management is great. That's the first step. But start to move into proactive problem management, not just reactive, that you deal with the big stuff, but you start looking at for patterns and trends so you can start to claw back this unplanned percentage that you're working on right now, reducing your meetings to give more of your time to value add. It starts with knowing. It starts with transparency. That's a lean principle.
Sean, what about you?
Yeah, I don't think I have much more to add, Marco. I thought it was a great information. Thank you, Troy.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, thanks both Sean and Troy. I actually had a lot of fun this afternoon just kind of listening to you guys. We could probably set up another session sometime soon and have a different type of discussion based on some of the intricacies. But lots of information. I just want to say thank you very much to all the people that joined us. We had a great turnout today. I hope you saw some value in terms of what we kind of talked about. If you do want to get in contact with CareWorks, if there's anything that we can help you out, you can send us an email to bdrteam@careworks.com. That's on the screen. And Troy is more than happy to share his contact information. So with that being said, everybody, thank you very much. Have a great day. Enjoy yourselves and take care.